Hello class, I'd like to welcome you to this learning journey on section 4.2. You should have your CC out in front of you and be fixing it as we go along. Our two aims for today are explain a niche or a niche and also to explain the three types of community interactions. This video will be posted on Canvas where you can watch it a second time if you need to slow it down or pause it in case you miss something important during class. All right, our first aim for today is to look at what an organism's niche is, or as some people like to call it, a niche. I'm a niche person, so that's the word I will be, pronunciation of the word that I will be using. A niche is a functional role, an occupation of a particular species in an ecosystem. And what the heck does that mean? But really what it means is that there's a pattern of living that all organisms, all species have. It incorporates the territory in which they live in, the shelter or their home, the temperature range that they live in, the requirements for moisture, their food and mating options, predators, relationships, and other things that are required for life. Niche is often described in terms of how the organism affects energy flow in its ecosystem and how it affects organisms around it. An example of a niche space that we see changing today is that of the polar bear, where the actual temperature range for the polar bear is causing some issues, and polar bears are having to move actually farther south because there's not ice for them to live on and walk on in the North Pole anymore, so they are overlapping with the niche range for the grizzly bear. And as we talked about in class before, there's a new type of organism called the pizzly or the gorilla bear that is occurring in nature because of the fact that we are actually changing the climate and affecting niche spaces of polar bears. We are going to, at the end of this video, watch a short video called Why Do More Species Live Near the Equator by PBS. If you are not part of my class, the link to the YouTube video is below. Okay, it's best to understand what the heck something is by giving you an example. So we're going to look at the earthworm, which is actually native to Europe. It is an invasive species, and it has a niche that is actually not compatible with the wildlife of Minnesota. So when an earthworm first came into the U.S., we used them for fishing, and they're great for fishing. However, they're horrible for the environment. So on the left here, you see what an actual ecosystem looks like without the earthworm. So you'll notice that there's lots of green trees. There's lots of grass and shrubs, and you can see that there's moisture and a lot of life, and there's going to be a lot of biodiversity, insects, small rodents and reptiles, and all sorts of things that have a place to actually live. When you add the earthworm into the system, however, where we get the situation on the right-hand side here, where all that extra habitat, all that other niche space that was provided by the other vegetation and other organisms that used to live there is gone. And now we have a very sparse area of the environment in Minnesota that is not conducive to the regular organisms that would live there because of one single species, the earthworm, that has been put into the ground in a spot where it was not had originally evolved to exist. As opposed to a niche, the habitat of an organism is a lot simpler of a concept. Habitat is just the physical location, which is determined by a species' ability to survive and reproduce under a range of environmental conditions. So where is the home that this organism lives? The picture that you see below is that of the Ngorongoro crater in Tanzania. I took this picture. The saying in Tanzania is that what falls in the crater stays in the crater. So when you look at things that don't have wings, like that zebra, and not the flamingos, those creatures, lions and giraffes and elephants, the ones that are in the crater stay in the crater. There's a fairly constant supply of water, and vegetation for herbivores and enough herbivores for predatory species to survive in the crater, and they stay there. Versus the habitat for lions that live in the Serengeti, the physical location is a little bit different, where actually environmental conditions do change and organisms need to move in order to survive. So the all the animals in the Serengeti follow where the water goes and migrate from Kenya to Tanzania, whereas here in the crater, waterfall is fairly constant and those critters do not go anywhere. So now that we talked about habitat and niche, let's look at actual community interactions. And those are looking at how species interact with each other. And we're going to look at coevolution first, which evolution happens to be my favorite topic. And that's when two or more species influence each other's change or physical appearance over time. We talked before about cheetahs and their speed and how that affects their prey items. In this example right here, I have a flower, and at the end point here is where all the nectar would be. I have a moth over here, and at the end point of its mouth, or its proboscis, its straw-like mouth part, is where it'd be able to slurp up in a straw manner the nectar that's at the end of the flower. What ends up happening is that when the moth puts the proboscis into the flower, the head piece of the moth hits the top of the flower and the pollen goes specifically from flower to flower. It's an advantageous trait for the flower because it knows for sure that the only other plant that this moth can get food from will be the same species as the flower. It's advantageous for the moth because the moth knows that it will not be competing with other organisms to get nectar from this flower because other organisms do not have a proboscis or a straw-like mouth part that's that long. When looking at community interactions and coevolution, we have something called the competitive exclusion principle, something we talked about before when we talked about evolution, and that is that two species cannot stably coexist and using the exact same resources. One is going to have a slight advantage over the other one, and because of that slight advantage, the one without the advantage is either going to become extinct or it's going to have to evolve towards a different ecological niche. And this is what leads species to distinct ecological niches. Species that share or have similar ecological niches. For example, in the picture below, we see the lion and the hyenas. They both live in packs, they both are top predators, they both live in the same parts of Africa, they both eat the same food resources, they use similar strategies for mating and reproducing, and they have similar niches. The lion, of course, is a little bit bigger and bulkier of an animal. Their pride sizes are smaller. Hyenas are a little smaller, but they're extremely strong, and their pride numbers tend to be in about 100 or so. And so they have a little bit of differences in terms of the way that they interact with their environment, but given a chance, because they have such similar niche spaces, they fight. A male lion will not hesitate to kill any hyena that it sees, that it is able to kill, and the same thing goes with hyenas and lions. If a group of hyenas run across a lion, they'll kill the lion. Neither one of these deaths or killings would result in any type of actual predation or food source for the other organism. It's just merely competition and pure competition. And we have space that's so close to each other that we're gonna have a little bit of some interaction going on. It's kind of like you and your little brother or little sister sitting in the back seat, and you have the line in the back seat of the car, and oh my gosh, you sit just as close to that line as you possibly can, just to irritate your sibling. But if you cross over the line, you know they're going to punch you. And that's kind of the same sort of principle here behind the competitive exclusion principle. When you get that close to the line of niches, and the niches are that close, when you barely cross the line, you get punched and go extinct, or else you gotta scoot over on the seat in the back of the car and move a little bit to the left so you're not too close to your siblings' side of the car. So we talk about competitive exclusion principles. This is another example. I actually took this picture when I was in Tanzania. You can see right here, this right here is a stork. This right here is a stork. Yeah, they're really ugly actually. There's a wildebeest carcass right in here. And right along the bottom here we see a bunch of vultures. And so really pecking order goes, the vultures are there first. And the storks try to come in and grab something and then run away, because the vultures will come in and attack. So the Malibu stork's strategy is to grab and run. The vulture strategy is to stay there. And then all of a sudden, this guy shows up to the party right here. He was apparently the top dog because he scared away all of the storks and half of the other vultures away from the carcass, which was actually pretty interesting to see him get super excited and start to do his little dance. But here we have organisms trying to coexist, and there's a lot of fighting going on when they're trying to share resources. Okay, what kind of relationship do we have between these organisms? I took this picture about 60 minutes after these two organisms interacted with one another, this lion and this zebra. And this is an example of predation, which actually would have been pretty awesome for me to see, but I missed it. And we're going to talk about what exactly a predator is in just a minute. It's not always something like a big lion like you would expect. So predators, or predation, is actually when an organism kills and feeds on another one. And the big word here is kills. And we'll talk about how that's different than parasitism in a minute, which is also feeding on another organism. But predation, you actually kill and you eat it. The intent is to kill, the intent is to eat. There are things that are nice and lovely, like this loon here. It's a predator. It eats fish. There are things that eat insects. Those things are also predators. Some insects eat other types of insects. They're predators. It's killing an organism and feeding upon it would be a type of predation. Next, your book talks about something called a keystone species. So before we talked about the ecological pyramid, and we talked about the ecological pyramid before, I'm going to draw it off to the side here. We have on the bottom, we have our producers, then we have our herbivores, and then we have our other consumers like our omnivores and our carnivores. And we've been focusing on how plant matter is a big deal. Because if we get rid of all the plants, then all the herbivores are going to die, and then all the carnivores are going to die. And this was a long-standing view of how ecology and interactions between species and their environment happened in the world for a very, very long time. One thing that was being missed was something called the keystone species. And a keystone species is a species, one species that can cause a dramatic change in the structure of a community. So we spent all this time, scientists spent all this time looking at the bottom of the pyramid and thinking that that was the end-all be-all, without realizing that at the top here we have something called an apex predator. And if you remove that apex predator, it actually affects the number of herbivores increases, which means the number or the amount of producers drastically decrease. So predators on the top predator is actually important in keeping an ecosystem intact, and a long time was spent looking at resources and saving the environment and different species and lots of conversations were had about actually getting rid of top predators, which is why for a long time wolves were removed from Yellowstone and other top predators were killed off rather rapidly, and now we're finding that this is causing unstable ecosystems. We're going to spend some more time later looking at a couple of videos and doing some activities with keystone species, but this is an approach where we look at the top of the pyramid, one top predator, one important predator, the apex predator, and how it keeps everything in check so there still is grass growing and the herbivores do not inherit the earth. Okay, now we're going to look at a big broad topic, and that's that of symbiosis. Symbiosis just simply means living together. This is the good, the bad, and the who cares types of relationships between different organisms. We're going to look at the 3 different types of symbiosis. I believe your book talks about all 3 types. If not, you're going to need to write one of them in. All right, what you're going to want to do is make this thinking map somewhere on your assignment. I know on your CC it's a chart. I think the thinking map is helpful in terms of getting things organized in your head because I get students who get symbiosis and commensalism sort of messed up. Symbiosis, as I said earlier, is living together. So that's my big term. There are 3 types. The first type is parasitism. The second type is mutualism. And the third type is commensalism. So parasitism, mutualism, and commensalism are all types of symbiotic relationships. They are all, parasitism, mutualism, and commensalisms are different ways that organisms live together. Take a second, write down this thinking map real quick so that you have this organized in your head and don't fall into making the same mistake that lots of other students make by getting some of these words mixed around. So parasitism, what is it? What happens? And does anyone die? Well, we have a parasite and we have a host organism. And it's a positive for the parasite and a negative for the host. And it's when the parasite feeds on and usually lives on or in another typically larger organism. Okay, so the parasites don't usually kill their prey, or they try not to. That's the difference between parasitism and predation. And the reason for that is because the parasite uses the host for food and a place to live. So you don't really want to kill your house and lose your food source that's constant. So parasites tend to be smaller, live inside their host, get both food and shelter all in one convenient location. All right, here are a couple of examples of parasites. First one I want to talk about is the tapeworm, which we see right here with the fish. Here is a picture of the tapeworm that's been magnified several times. You'll notice up at the top here there's all those hooks. The hooks hook into the intestinal tract of the organism that eats the tapeworm's eggs. So you would ingest eggs, the eggs would hatch, the tapeworm would grow, the hooks would hook into your intestinal tract, and you'd get this big, long worm structure that grows into your intestinal tract. The nice thing for the tapeworm is that it is nice and warm and protected inside your body, and you will be as the host, the individual that finds the food, eats the food, digests the food, brings the food straight to the tapeworm, and the tapeworm, all it does is absorb the food. It doesn't have a mouth because it doesn't even need to digest food. You've already done that for it. We usually don't have problems in first world countries with tapeworms because tapeworms lay eggs in the intestinal tract, and those eggs get released with the organism's feces. And we have a good sanitary system in the United States and in other first world countries, but in places and in the wild animals often get tapeworms. That's not the case. So an organism will excrete feces onto the ground, it will rain, the tapeworm eggs will stick to the grass, another organism comes along later and eats the grass or eats the insect that has the grass or somehow will actually pick the eggs up off the ground in the process of eating, even if the feces has washed away, and then those organisms will get tapeworms. Another type of parasite is the mosquito, which is over here on the right. Mosquito, we see them as parasites. They're smaller than we are. They don't actually kill us. If they killed us, they'd be a predator, but since they don't kill us, we put them in the parasite category. They don't use us as a shelter or a home, but they do use our blood for egg laying. So female mosquitoes are the only mosquitoes that bite. They use that to form eggs. And I don't know if anyone knows this or not, but mosquitoes actually eat nectar as an energy or a food source. So both male and female mosquitoes, when they're hungry, they land on a flower to get a meal. And it's only when they need to lay eggs would they actually bite you. The other good example of a parasite is the wood tick that's over here. In this case, the wood tick actually would use you as a home while it's feasting on your blood with its chompers. And then when the wood tick is full enough with blood that it's able to release eggs, it will let go. And it doesn't need a home anymore because it will die and release its eggs. So I just got done talking to you about how parasitism has to do with eating or feeding upon a host and using a host as a home. There is also another type of parasitism, and we have an example of that in the brown-headed cowbird in the state of Minnesota, along with some other parts of the U.S. The brown-headed cowbird is not going out and eating anything. What it is doing instead is it is taking over the ability of other songbirds to reproduce. So this little bird here, this little brown-headed cowbird, will wait until a songbird has laid a nest of eggs. It will sneak in and it will lay its own special little egg in the nest, and then it will abandon it. And what will happen is the songbird will come and sit on all of these eggs, incubate them, and then over the course of time, the baby birds hatch. This, of course, is the brown-headed cowbird chick, and these are the chicks for the songbird right here. You can definitely see that the odds are in favor of this guy right here. He's got the biggest mouth, he's got the biggest body. Mom and dad are going to feed him more. He's a parasite in the fact that songbird chicks actually normally don't make it because the songbird is so busy feeding worms to the baby cowbird, and so the baby cowbird is the one that grows up and survives, and the little songbird chicks don't make it. All right, this right here is not predation, but it is actually mutualism, where this wrasse and this eel are actually mutually benefiting one another. It could easily be a predation experience because I'm sure that fish, that wrasse, I believe it's a wrasse, so somebody might say otherwise, I could be wrong, is an easy meal for this eel, but the eel knows that it's better off not eating the wrasse because the wrasse will actually act like a little dentist and pull the parasites and things out of the eel so that the eel gets some relief from the parasites. And in the process, the little wrasse fish here gets a free meal while he's cleaning the teeth of the eel. Next example of symbiotic relationships or living closely together is mutualism. It is a really easy concept. It's mutual beneficial relationships. So both species benefit from the relationship. It's plus plus, right? The bumblebee gets a source of nectar and pollen for food source, and the flower gets pollinated, and both benefit from that relationship. Okay. The ultimate winner in mutualism is actually the venomous Portuguese man of war. For a long time, we thought that it was a jellyfish. We thought it was an organism, one single organism, but it's not even an it. It's a they. Okay? A Portuguese man of war is an animal made up of a colony of organisms working together. So there's 4 different organisms or 4 different separate polyps that work together to form something that looks like an organism. One of them, so one part or one, and it has different DNA even. One part is called the gas-filled bladder, so that's an organism of sorts. It has different DNA than the tentacle part of the Portuguese man of war, which is considered the second organism. Then those muscles and the tentacles draw the prey up to the third organism with different DNA in the digestive system, and we call it the digestive organism, which digests everything. And we have a 4th polyp organism that contains the reproductive organism, so it sort of organizes the different parts and pieces and gets it all together so you can have a little baby Portuguese man of war. But it is actually 4 different types of things that are living together that create one ultimate looking organism. That's 4 different ones. If you look online, there's a video on the Portuguese man of war. I think it's okay to be smart. If you're actually in my class, it's on my Canvas website. It talks about the creatures and how complicated it is, but it's actually pretty awesome case of mutualism. All right, the next one we have is commensalism. So what is it? What happens? Does anyone die? This is when one species benefits and the other is neither harmed nor helped. So we call it a plus-minus relationship. So here I have a whale fin. It has some barnacles growing on it. It's been considered commensalistic. Barnacles really aren't hurting the whale. Barnacles are definitely benefiting from being on the whale. Commensalism is kind of an interesting concept because in the big picture, the barnacles really aren't creating lots of harm to the whale, but if too many barnacles got onto a whale fin, then it obviously would become a parasitistic relationship. So commensalism is a fine line of almost becoming a parasite, but not quite. So in this example, it's commensalistic. The whale's not being really harmed, and the barnacles are definitely being helped. Okay, so let's look at another awesome example of commensalism. So, and you guys are going to watch a video on this, which will make this even better. So this picture right here is one of your hair follicles on your face. It's either from your eyebrow or your eyelash. This right here is your eyelash. This is your hair right here. Okay, now each one of these things that I'm outlining in blue is a mite. It is another living organism that lives inside the hair follicles on your skin. And our eyes, lashes, are the home to up to about 20 of them at a time, and they live on our oil secretions and our dead skin cells. And right there, they're magnified 225 times, so if you go in the mirror and try to look, you're not going to see them. And actually, if you decide that this really grosses you out and you go home and you pluck out all your eyelashes and all your eyebrows because you think you'll be doing yourself a favor, I want you to look at this picture down here and show you that if you take out your hair, which is this right here, look at all that extra space you've given these mites. So these mites actually will live in spaces where you don't even have hair. So I suggest you not pluck out your eyebrows when you get home. This is what they look like if we magnify them. You guys are going to watch this awesome video that talks about these little mites that are probably grossing you out. And I'm so sorry that I'm not there to see that, because this is like one of my favorite slides to show students. And I'm not even in school today. Or I'm not here to look at your petrified face. But yeah, you have 20 of these little mites around each each hair follicle, and you didn't even know they were there. Now it's going to be some good conversation over dinner. You could probably, if you go on Canvas, you can play the video and show your parents. I suggest dinner time being the best time to have your parents get educated about the commensalistic relationship they have with their tiny eye mites. Well, that's the end of the presentation. Enjoy your video on why most things live near the equator, and also the video on eye mites. And if you have any questions, make sure you bring them to class, and we'll talk to you about them then. All right. Peace out. I'm done. Enjoy your mites. I do have one thing I want to add at the end here. I have not watched this video. Okay, take it back. I did watch part of it and realized it was bad, so I redid it, but I'm not watching it a second time. So if I've made a mistake or you have any questions, please write them down and let me know. Also, if you would like to watch the video on mites again when I come back to class, make sure you make that request.